Welcome to your deep dive. So, have you ever felt like you're kind of stuck in a rut? Like repeating the same stuff even when you know it's not really good for you?
Ugh, tell me about it.
Well, today we're going to unpack all that with Charles Duhigg's book, The Power of Habit.
Oh, yeah, I love that book.
Right. And our expert is here to help us figure out how we can use this knowledge to level up our lives.
It's like we're about to get this owner's manual for our brains.
Seriously. So to kick things off, Duhigg tells this incredible story about Lisa Allen, a woman who completely changed her life. Picture this. She quits smoking, loses weight, runs a marathon, starts a master's degree, A&D buys a house, all within a crazy short amount of time.
I know, right? It's wild. And the craziest part is she didn't try to change everything at once. Lisa just focused on changing one key habit, smoking,
Yeah.
and it totally transformed her life. Researchers studied her and found that her brain actually physically changed as she quit smoking.
Whoa, so it's like those before and after photos, but for your brain.
Exactly. New neural pathways formed, like building new roads in a city, and those new pathways started to override the old ones that were connected to her smoking. It's proof that our brains are way more adaptable than we think, constantly rewiring themselves based on what we do.
That's incredible. If changing just one habit can have that kind of ripple effect, imagine what understanding how habits work could do for all of us.
Think of your brain as like your phone's battery. It's always trying to save energy, so it makes routines into habits to free up mental space for other things. Kind of like closing apps on your phone to make it run smoother.
So habits are like shortcuts, making daily life more efficient. But we all know that sometimes those shortcuts can lead to some pretty bad habits.
Totally. And since those habits run on autopilot, it's easy to fall into those unhealthy patterns without even noticing.
Yeah, it's scary how easily that can happen. That's why it's so important to understand that habit loop, which Duhigg breaks down so well. It's like a user manual for our brains, like you were saying.
Exactly.
All right, so let's break it down. Duhigg describes this habit loop as a three-step process: cue, routine, and reward. What does that actually look like in practice?
Okay, so think of it like this. The cue is the trigger, like when you see a plate of cookies just sitting there. The routine is what you do next. You grab a cookie and eat it. And the reward is that awesome, sugary satisfaction you get that makes you want to grab another one.
Ooh, those cookies are calling my name now.
Right.
Okay, so to change a habit, we got to understand this loop and then figure out how to interrupt it. I love how Duhigg brings in these examples from the marketing world to show how companies are using the habit loop to influence what we buy.
Yeah. Like the Febreze story. At first, it flopped because it was trying to fix a problem. People didn't even realize they had eliminating odors they were totally used to.
So they were trying to solve a problem people didn't know they had.
Yeah, exactly.
So how did they turn that around?
Well, the researchers at P&G had to hack the habit loop. They needed to create a craving for the feeling of freshness, a reward that wasn't there naturally just from getting rid of the bad smells.
Okay, so instead of focusing on the problem, they focused on the outcome.
Right.
Smart.
They added a nice scent to Febreze and marketed it as the finishing touch to your cleaning routine. This gave people a sense of satisfaction and completion, turning Febreze into the reward itself.
So they basically invented a need.
Pretty much.
And it reminds me of the Pepsodent story. Before Claude Hopkins, people weren't exactly rushing to brush their teeth.
Nope, definitely not.
So how did that change?
Hopkins figured out his cue, the presence of tooth film, which we all have. Then he turned that into something people felt like they had to fix. Finally, Pepsodent came along with that minty tingle, and bam, that's the reward. That squeaky clean feeling we all associate with good oral hygiene.
So he created a whole new habit loop around a product that already existed.
Yeah.
If marketers can use the habit loop to get us to buy stuff, can we use that same knowledge to upgrade our own habits?
Absolutely, and that's where Duhigg's golden rule of habit change comes in. You keep the old cue and the reward, but you got to swap out the routine.
So same trigger, same reward, but different action.
Exactly. He explains it through Tony Dungy, the NFL coach who took the losing Tampa Bay Buccaneers and turned them into winners. He knew he couldn't just tell his players to forget their old habits.
So he had to reprogram them.
Totally. He drilled them on new plays until they became automatic. It's like breaking a nail-biting habit by squeezing a stress ball instead. You keep the stress, which is the cue, and the relief, which is the reward, but you change what you actually do.
This is giving me so many ideas. But habit change isn't always easy. Duhigg talks about belief in community being super important too,
Oh,
right?
definitely. He tells the story of John, who struggled with alcohol addiction. He tried quitting so many times, but it wasn't until he joined ALA that it stuck. That community gave him support, accountability, and a belief system that helped him stay sober.
So it was more than just willpower.
Way more. That community became part of his new habit loop. Having people who understood his struggles and celebrated his wins made the change feel possible.
That makes a lot of sense. The right support system can be a game changer. This brings us to keystone habits. This is fascinating to me.
Keystone habits are like small changes that have this ripple effect. They're like the keystone in an archway. Pull it out and the whole thing falls apart.
Whoa, I never thought of it like that.
Keep it strong and the rest holds together.
Okay, give me an example.
Paul O'Neill, the CEO of Alcoa, made worker safety his top priority. Seems kind of unrelated to profits, right?
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a typical CEO move.
But it totally worked. Remember how we talked about this cascade of positive changes? It improved their quality, productivity, and ultimately their profits went up.
That's amazing. So small changes can create huge momentum.
Exactly. And it works in our personal lives, too. Something as simple as keeping a food journal can be a keystone habit.
Really, just writing down everything I eat.
Yeah, it sounds basic, but that tracking creates self-awareness. You start to see patterns, you make healthier choices, and that can lead to weight loss and other positive changes.
Okay, I can see how that would work. But let's be real, changing habits takes willpower, and we don't always have a ton of that.
Definitely not. Duhigg compares willpower to a muscle. It gets tired after you use it, just like your arm after lifting weights.
So if I use all my willpower to resist that extra slice of pizza, I'm more likely to snap at my coworker later on.
You got it. We all have a limited willpower reserve. Starbucks actually uses this idea in their employee training.
No way. Really, how does that work?
They give their employees routines for dealing with tough situations. They even have something called the latte method for handling angry customers. It helps them respond consistently even when they're stressed.
So it's like having these pre-programmed responses that help you save your willpower for when you really need it. I like that idea.
Yeah, it's smart. And we can do the same thing in our own lives. We can think about those inflection points, those moments where our willpower is going to be tested and have a plan in place.
Like knowing that 3 p.m. is my snack attack time and having a healthy snack ready to go.
Exactly. That little bit of planning can make a huge difference. These inflection points aren't just personal either. They exist in big companies, too. Places like Starbucks and the Container Store, they train their employees to spot those moments and respond with set routines to make sure things run smoothly.
It's amazing how something as simple as a habit can be so powerful in our own lives and even in huge organizations.
Totally. And that leads us to how habits shape social movements, which is super interesting.
Yeah, that's where we see habits at a whole other level. It's mind-blowing to think about how a single action, fueled by a belief in justice, can create a movement that changes the world.
And a powerful example of that is Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott.
Right, talk about a keystone habit. It's incredible to think that one act of defiance, amplified by social networks and shared purpose, could start such a powerful chain reaction.
And what's really fascinating is how the boycott spread. It wasn't just close friends supporting each other, it was also the influence of people they knew less well, connected through those wider social networks.
So it was like peer pressure, but for a good cause. People didn't want to be left out of this movement.
You got it. It shows how the fear of missing out, of being isolated, can be a powerful motivator, even if it starts with something as simple as refusing to give up your seat on a bus.
Okay, so we've seen how habits can be a force for good. But Duhigg also dives into the darker side of habits, those times when things go really wrong.
Oh, yeah, for sure. He talks about Brian Thomas, who was actually acquitted of murdering his wife because it turned out he was having a sleep terror.
That's scary. How do habits play into something like that?
Well, sleep terrors can trigger those deep-seated habits, like the fight-or-flight response, but without you being consciously aware of it. In Brian's case, it seems like the sleep terror activated this defensive habit, which led to this really tragic, unintended outcome.
So he was basically running on autopilot,
Yeah.
driven by a primal habit that bypassed his conscious mind.
Exactly. It brings up all these questions about responsibility and accountability when habits intersect with the legal system.
It really makes you wonder, how much control do we actually have over our actions if they're driven by these deeply ingrained habits?
Right. It's a big question. And it gets even more complicated when you factor in addiction. Like Angie Bachman, the woman who lost everything gambling and was actually sued by the casino for her debts.
Hola, the casino sued her.
Yeah. Can you believe that? It shows how companies can exploit our vulnerabilities and profit from our habits, especially when those habits are linked to addiction.
That's a disturbing thought.
It is. It really is. But despite all that, I think the biggest takeaway from Duhigg is that we're not just puppets of our habits. We can learn to understand them, to question them, and most importantly, to change them.
That's a really powerful message, especially after hearing about some of those darker examples.
Totally. It all comes back to understanding those hidden forces that shape our lives, you know?
And then using that knowledge to create positive change for ourselves and the world around us.
Exactly. It's like we can actually reprogram ourselves, which is pretty cool. And you know what's really fascinating? Duhigg takes all this stuff about habits and willpower and applies it to, like, entire companies. He shows how companies are basically run on systems of habits, just like we are.
So a company's culture is like a giant collection of everyone's habits all mashed together.
Exactly. And if leaders can understand and shape those habits, they can change how the company performs and even its whole culture.
This reminds me of that story about Rhode Island Hospital, where a surgeon operated on the wrong side of a patient's head. Oh my gosh, that is like every patient's worst nightmare. How could that even happen?
Well, Duhigg says the hospital had this culture where everyone deferred to the surgeons, like they were these all-powerful beings. So even when nurses had concerns, they didn't feel like they could speak up.
So you're saying this tiny habit, nurses not speaking up, was actually a symptom of a much bigger problem.
Totally. It created this power dynamic that stopped important information from being shared, and ultimately it put patients at risk.
That's a really powerful example of how these seemingly small habits can have huge unintended consequences. Yikes.
It shows how organizational habits can create these blind spots that lead to outcomes no one wants. It's a total contrast to that Alcoa story, where Paul O'Neill made worker safety a keystone habit and basically changed the entire company culture.
Right. We talked about how focusing on safety actually led to improvements in quality and productivity, too. It's amazing how one change can have such a ripple effect.
And O'Neill was successful because he understood how to actually change those habits. He didn't just say safety first. He made it part of everything they did.
So it's not enough to just talk about it. You got to walk the walk and create systems that support those values.
You got it. O'Neill created routines and communication channels and feedback mechanisms that were all focused on safety. He basically rewired the company's habits from the bottom up.
That makes me wonder, how can leaders actually change those habits, especially when they're so ingrained in a company's culture? It seems like a tough thing to do.
Duhigg has some suggestions. First, you got to figure out what the current habit loops look like. Like, what are the cues and routines and rewards that are driving those behaviors? Then you have to identify those key inflection points, the moments when change is most likely to stick.
So it's about anticipating those moments when people are open to new ideas.
Exactly. And finally, you have to create new routines that support the values you're trying to build. It's like changing individual habits, just on a bigger scale.
But I imagine it takes a lot of effort and commitment from everyone to pull that off.
Oh, for sure. You need strong leadership, clear communication, and everyone has to be willing to challenge how things have always been done.
This is making me think about the habits in my own workplace. Sometimes it feels like things are so stuck, but maybe there's more room for change than I think.
Maybe so. And it's not just about work. Duhigg also looks at how companies use data to understand and even predict our habits as consumers, which is kind of freaky.
Oh yeah, that Target story.
Yeah.
Kind of creepy, but super interesting.
I know, right? Remember how Target figured out how to identify pregnant shoppers before they even told their families?
Yeah, that dad who was furious when his teenage daughter started getting coupons for baby stuff. Turned out she was pregnant.
That's the one. It just shows how much companies can learn about us from what we buy. Target's analysts found these specific habits that were linked to pregnancy and then used that to target expectant mothers with ads.
That definitely raises some ethical questions. But it also shows how powerful data can be in understanding how people behave.
For sure. It's like having a peek into our collective unconscious, seeing those patterns we might not even be aware of ourselves.
It's a little bit Big Brother-ish, but also kind of fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And companies are using all that knowledge to influence what we choose, from what we buy to what music we listen to, and even how we vote.
Wow. So are you telling me they're manipulating us?
It can definitely feel that way sometimes, especially when you see how these techniques are used, but Hey, let's not get too paranoid just yet.
Okay, good. I was getting a little freaked out there.
I mean, look, remember that Outkast song, Hey Ya? It was a huge hit, right? Even though it sounded totally different from anything they'd done before.
Yeah, it was like a total departure for them. How did they pull that off?
They used this clever strategy called sandwiching. Radio DJs would play Hey Ya in between two songs that were already popular and had a similar vibe.
So they kind of eased people into this new sound by surrounding it with something familiar.
Exactly. They made Hey Ya feel familiar, even though it's totally new. And this idea of using existing habits to introduce new stuff can work in all sorts of situations.
Like how the government tried to get people to eat more organ meats during World War II. I'm not sure I would have been down for that.
I hear ya. It's a classic example of how habits and cultural norms shape our eating habits.
So how did they get people to try something they weren't used to?
They used that sandwiching trick again. They told housewives to incorporate organ meats into familiar dishes, like meatloaf. So by hiding it within something comfortable, they made it more acceptable.
That's pretty clever. It's like sneaking veggies into your kids' mac and cheese.
Exactly. And it shows how understanding habits can be used to help people overcome resistance to change.
So whether we're talking about our own habits, company culture, or even societal change, it seems like the big takeaway is habits are powerful, but we're not powerless. We can learn to understand them and change them, right?
Right. We can learn to understand these hidden forces that shape our lives and then use that knowledge to create the changes we want to see.
So what does all this mean for our listeners? What can they do to start mastering their own habits? What's the first step? That's what I want to know. We've talked about all these amazing ideas from Duhigg's book, but how do we actually use this stuff in our own lives?
Well, Duhigg gives us this really practical framework for habit change. He calls it the 4 laws of behavior change. And the first step is all about identifying the routine.
Okay, so what does that actually mean? Like, walk me through it.
Think about a habit you want to change. Anything. Let's say you want to stop hitting that snooze button every morning.
Oh, man, that's my struggle.
I feel you. So the first thing is to really pay attention to the routine itself. Like, what are the exact things you're doing?
Okay, so in this case, the routine is hearing the alarm, grabbing my phone, and tapping that snooze button. Then, of course, rolling over and falling back asleep for those precious few minutes.
Exactly. It sounds simple, but that awareness is super important. Once you've got the routine down, you can experiment with rewards.
Okay, this is the fun part. So we're trying to figure out what's really driving the habit, right? Like,
Yeah.
what's the reward I'm getting from hitting snooze?
Exactly. Maybe it's that extra bit of sleep. Or maybe it's the feeling of being all cozy and warm under the covers. Try different things and see what really satisfies the craving.
So instead of snoozing, I could try getting up right away and having a cup of coffee while listening to my favorite podcast.
That's a great idea.
If that gives me that same feeling of enjoyment, maybe I won't be so tempted to hit snooze.
Exactly. It's about finding a new routine that gives you a similar reward, but without the bad stuff like running late and feeling stressed.
Okay, I'm with you. So we've identified the routine and experimented with rewards. What's next?
Now we got to figure out the cue, the trigger. What's making the habit happen in the first place? Is it a certain time, a feeling, a location? Like with the snooze button, the cue is pretty obvious. It's that alarm clock sound.
Yeah, but there could be other cues too, right? Maybe it's feeling too warm under the covers, or maybe it's dreading the day ahead.
You got it. Sometimes those cues are sneaky. Once you figure out what's triggering the habit, you can start to anticipate it and come up with a plan.
Which brings us to the final step, the plan.
This is where you get strategic. Instead of just saying, I'm not going to hit snooze anymore, you actually write down a specific plan, like, when my alarm goes off, I'm going to get out of bed and head straight to the kitchen to make coffee.
So you're taking away the decision-making in the moment when you're most likely to give in.
Exactly. Plus, writing it down makes you more accountable. It's like a promise to yourself.
I love that. This whole framework has given me so many ideas for tackling my own bad habits. But what about those times when we slip up? I mean, nobody's perfect, right?
Of course not. Duhigg says setbacks are totally normal. The important thing is to not beat yourself up about it, learn from it, and get back on track. It's all about progress, not perfection.
That's a good reminder. So to wrap things up, what does all of this mean for our listener? We've explored this whole world of habits, from how they affect our brains to how they impact companies and even social movements.
It's a lot to take in, for sure.
It is.
But the big takeaway is that we're not controlled by our habits. We have the power to understand them, to question them, and ultimately to change them.
It's like we've been given this map to our own inner workings.
Totally.
We can choose the routines that help us become the people we want to be.
Exactly. And remember, even tiny changes, those small wins, can lead to huge changes over time. Start with one keystone habit you want to change and go from there.
That's it for your deep dive. I hope you've enjoyed exploring the fascinating world of habits with us.
Me too. This was fun.
And until next time, keep those brain gears turning.